Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fertility Confidence Podcast. We're going to do a really quick, really dirty coverage of one of the probably more important fertility hormones that doesn't really get talked about all that much. We've had a few episodes previously. We've called insulin like the forgotten hormone of fertility, but today we're talking about FSH. And I feel like a lot of times this is just such a throwaway lab marker that's done and not actually used to its full potential. So what exactly is FSH? How do we test it? And then how do we use that information to further our fertility journey? That is what we're going to cover today. So first and foremost, FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and it's released from the pituitary. And what it actually does is help the follicles mature and finish their growth cycle that they're like halted in the menstrual phase. So they're stimulating follicle maturation. So already we can have a bit of follicle stimulating hormone. That should make sense, right? And already we have a bit of an idea of like, okay, what could this hormone potentially be telling us? But proper timing is really crucial here. So we typically want to see FSH done cycle day 3, and we sort of give a range of like cycle day 2, 3, 4 is ideal. Anytime outside of that, we don't really have the data to actually know what an optimal level is. And the reason for that is twofold, honestly. Every woman is going to be slightly different because their menstrual cycle is slightly different, right? So for example, if you take someone who ovulates a touch early and compare to someone who ovulates a bit late, their degree of FSH shift and when that happens in their cycle is going to be drastically different. The person who ovulates earlier is likely going to have that rise in FSH happening earlier in their cycle versus the person who's ovulating a little bit later. And that also might help us to see for long irregular cycles, well, what is going on in those early days of the cycle? What are the hormones doing? How does this relate back to potential root cause, and sort of go from there. So cycle day 2, 3, 4 ideally. And when we're testing FSH, we're coupling that with an estradiol. So we have 3 estrogens in our body. The main estrogen that I don't want to say care about, because truthfully, like they all have their utility, but E2 estradiol is our main sort of estrogen, our main active estrogen in our body. And so that is what we typically check. So when someone's saying, I do this all the time. We just ran boot camp. And so teaching about labs, I flip back and forth between using the term estrogen and using the term estradiol. And obviously that can be very confusing. Know that in the language of fertility, and when we're speaking about labs, those two things are basically the same. But you can look at total estrogen, which is different. Total estrogen is a combination of all 3, not just estradiol. So when we're in the lab world and we're talking about day 3 labs and we want to look at estrogen in relation to FSH, we're talking about estradiol. That's what we want to see. And the two go hand in hand and give us an idea of ovarian reserve and egg quality. So if you've been around for a while, you've heard me definitely say before that we don't have any tests or ways to really assess egg quality. The closest thing that we have is doing IVF, is doing an egg retrieval. And even that's not perfect because we still have sperm involved, right? So like we still can't completely negate the sperm actually playing a role if we're assuming that there's quality issues. But when we look at FSH and estradiol together, if FSH is on the higher side, we can make an assumption that either the eggs aren't listening the way that we need them to be, i.e. potentially quality issues or reserve issues. So let's go back for a second. Why do we want to look at these things together? Because estrogen actually plays a role in how FSH is managed in the body. So when the follicle is developing, when we're talking egg, so we need an egg to meet the sperm. The egg is within a follicle. The follicle is like the shell of the egg, basically. That's how I talk about it in Fertility Confidence Method. The follicle is the shell of the egg. And when that follicle is developing, all of the follicles in the ovaries are actually releasing estradiol and something called inhibin B. And what that does is it basically keeps FSH in check. So this is where that reserve piece comes into play. If there's not a lot of follicles present to down-regulate that FSH response, we're going to see higher levels because that feedback loop isn't there. When there's lots of follicles available in the ovary and there's good production of estradiol and inhibin B, that FSH is more in line with where we want it to be. That's where the ovarian reserve concept comes into play. So if we're seeing elevated levels of FSH, and when I say elevated, I'm talking over 10, we're potentially dealing with ovarian reserve issues. Now, if you've got your labs in front of you and you are close to a 10 or an over 10, before you totally panic, I just want to say that this isn't a perfect system. And it is also not the best way to know. The best way to know your ovarian reserve is to do an antral follicle count on ultrasound. And ideally, we're doing that sometime around day 5-ish, day 5, 6, 7, 8. We kind of request from our clients. And that way, we're getting a good look at all the tiny follicles that are being recruited in that cycle. And that is a much, much better view of ovarian reserve, to actually go in and see what is there versus the labs, because there's other reasons the labs might be wonky, quality being one of them, right? If the eggs just aren't listening very well, or your estrogen is low, perhaps you have lots of eggs present, but your body is struggling to make estrogen, then there's none of that suppression happening with the FSH, and so FSH is climbing. Those are other reasons why. So I always, whenever we have someone come in and work with us and they're like, my FSH is high and my doctor thinks I'm never going to get pregnant on my own, we always want to say, okay, well, let's make sure we have the whole picture here. Have you done an antral follicle count? No. Okay, cool. Before we panic about that, or before we panic that your AMH is low, let's actually go in and see what's there. That's a significantly better marker of ovarian reserve, okay? The other piece I kind of just threw in there is when our estradiol is low, our FSH can be falsely elevated. So it might not actually have to do with egg quality or follicle development, but more so around your body's estrogen production. Are we getting enough healthy fats? Are we getting enough protein? Are we getting enough nutrients and building blocks so that your body can actually make estrogen? Maybe that's what it's struggling with. So we always want to look at those two together and then take that information and interpret it based on you and your body and what else we know about your journey. Because just with that number being high, it doesn't necessarily shut the door for you. So in a perfect world, we're seeing that FSH between 4 and 6. When it's between 6 and 10, my clients will all giggle when I say this, but between 6 and 10, we kind of say like, okay, cool. It's a little bit high. Have we done our AFC? Do we have our estradiol? Is there anything else we know going on that might be impacting this? How is stress right now? Is this the first time it has been high? Let's check it again in a couple of cycles, because guess what? Cycle to cycle, there's variation here. We don't have the same follicle recruitment each and every single cycle. You might have a cycle that doesn't have a lot of follicle recruitment, and you might have a cycle that does. It's another reason why AMH also isn't always the most accurate, and we can see it fluctuate. A lot of people say it doesn't change, but it can. So we always want to take our numbers and then plop it into your body, right? Because your body and your fertility is unique to you. So what do these numbers mean based on what we already know about you? And if FSH is off, let's check it again, okay? Before we get like totally worked up about it, let's look at all the puzzle pieces. Let's put a plan in place. And let's check it again in a few months and see what's going on. And then we can go from there. So hopefully this was helpful. I will be back next week. Have a beautiful rest of your week, and I will talk to you soon.